Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all of the playoff tiers, tried to break down where everyone sits as we get into the final 2 weeks, really the home stretch here, and there's still plenty of chaos that can unfold, but we're starting to get a little bit clearer of a picture, and we'll get into that right about now. Who's in and where are they coming from is a big time question that people have been asking. I mean, Big Ten and SEC fans on Twitter right now going at each other very, very aggressively around Indiana, around Tennessee, and let's break it all down here because this thing is getting a little bit confusing, at least for me. But let's jump into this, and I think the biggest question and one of the biggest debates as we get closer is in the Big Ten. Or, excuse me, we're starting with the SEC. I had my notes a little bit out of order here, but let's get into the SEC first. The SEC has a lot less scenarios for the conference title now that LSU has fallen out of that equation. Makes things a little bit easier. For the CFP, not a ton easier. I'm not going to touch South Carolina because it would be a nightmare to figure out how they would possibly make their way back up. So we're focusing on those top six teams. Those are the teams that are really in this race. Those are the teams that are really fighting for something down the stretch. Georgia and Ole Miss, we talked about them. If they win out, they're in. I don't think there's a ton of question there. I do think there's a little bit of question when you get beyond that. Now, you have an Alabama team. I'm 90% sure if they win out, they are in, regardless of what happens in the SEC title. There is a world where you have a 10-3 Alabama team coming off an SEC title loss. You have a 10-2 Tennessee team that didn't go to the SEC championship but beat Alabama. How do you handle that? Because I think that's a very interesting conversation. I don't necessarily think they're going to punish an Alabama team that went to the SEC championship because you're going to be put in a really bad spot down the stretch if you have teams actively avoiding the championship, which we'll talk about the Lane Kiffin comments down the road, but upsetting at the very least. But at the end of the day, it would put you in a tough spot. Alabama would have one more loss. One of the losses would be to the team that has a pretty comparable schedule, a pretty comparable resume, but they have the win over you. So it's going to be a really hard argument. I think Alabama would still get in over Tennessee, but Tennessee fans would be none too happy. I can promise you that. Again, for Texas, I think they are in if they win out. I feel pretty confident if they go to Atlanta, it's not going to be a question. They could be in at 10-2 if they lose to A&M, but a lot of stuff would have to happen. They would immediately drop to the back of the line behind Tennessee, behind Ole Miss, and all of those other teams, and then they would just have to hope that Ole Miss loses, that Tennessee loses to Vanderbilt, that Georgia loses to Georgia Tech. So too much stuff would have to happen there. If they go 10-2, they're in trouble, no doubt about that. They wouldn't have the quality win. I've said it before, a 10-2 Texas should not get into the field by any means. And then Texas A&M, kind of the same thing for Texas. The caveat is if they lose to Texas, they're done. There's no, making your way back up. There's no, maybe a million things could happen and they could find their way back in. But with the loss to South Carolina, they would drop all the way below them. There's no way they're finding their way back up. So while Texas technically has a chaos scenario that they could get in 10-2, I don't think A&M has the same luxury. We'll see what happens the rest of the way. Or they wouldn't be at 10-2, they'd be at 9-3. So obviously they would be in a lot of trouble. But for Tennessee, this is the team. They're just waiting for a spot. They're waiting for a spot to open up. They're waiting for something to jump at them. And the question is, if they win out and one of Notre Dame, Penn State, Indiana, if they lose by 2 scores or more, we'll talk about kind of the mathematics of all of that here pretty soon. But I think you're in. If anyone else loses above you in the SEC, I believe that you're in. Right now, I think you're the number 13 team. I think if everything plays out normally, you will be the 13th team. If all the, ranked teams win, if all the favored teams win and it rolls out that way, I would expect that to be the outcome for Tennessee. So they're in a tough spot. They're waiting for someone else to lose right about now, or they're waiting for Ohio State to just body bag Indiana. So a lot of things on the plate, and I can say confidently they are big Buckeye fans this weekend. They are big Black Knight fans this weekend because if Notre Dame or Indiana fall, they're in a much better footing as they go forward. But as you can see, there is a very clear line of demarcation here. A&M is right on the outside, and then South Carolina pretty far down. So A&M is one of those teams that they know if they win out the rest of the way, they're likely in. I think they're one of the teams that a 10-2 A&M or 10-3 A&M, losing in the SEC championship could be up for debate. But again, I don't think they'll get punished for that. So I do think right now Georgia has the best odds. They just got to win out the next 2 games, regardless of if they go to the SEC championship or not. They are in. And then you do have a team in Tennessee that is still minus odds. it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. Maybe after this week, they're even further down the road to getting one of those spots. Maybe they've taken a big step back because Indiana got a 3-point loss or something like that. So going to be interesting to watch that breakdown. But now we'll get over to the Big Ten, and this one is a lot easier. It's a lot more digestible. You have those 4 teams up top, and that's about it. Much respect to Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa. Really love y'all's teams. Not quite on the level of these top 4 teams right here. Oregon, we've talked about them. They have punched their ticket. I don't think anything could happen over the next 2 weeks for them to miss that. Just being totally honest, if you are in a conference championship in the Big Ten or the SEC, I don't think you're missing out. If you do miss out, then maybe it's that Alabama 10-3 against a 10-2 Tennessee type situation. But that's really the only one that I can see that happening in. And then for Ohio State, you just got to win out. I think you could be in with a loss to Indiana, but it would definitely add some questions. You would have that Penn State win, but then you'd be up against Tennessee that would have an Alabama win. So you'd be in that kind of group that you just do not want to be in if you're Ohio State. So I think they would likely be in if they were 10-2, to be totally honest, but the noise from the SEC crowd will be very, very loud, and we'll see what happens there. If they win this weekend, if they win against Michigan, they are in no matter what. If they lose against Michigan, maybe this thing gets a little bit more interesting again. But again, it's going to be really interesting to watch that unfold. Ohio State should be in if everything goes as planned the rest of the way. Penn State, you got to win out. There's really no caveat here. You cannot lose one more game, in my mind. You don't really have that win to hang your hat on other than West Virginia to start the year, and not quite the win you want to hang your hat on right about now. So I do think they have to win out the rest of the way. If they don't, they're in a lot of trouble. They still technically can get to Indy for the Big Ten championship, but would need one of these big upsets like Michigan over Ohio State or Purdue over Indiana, I believe is that final game. So, and then we get to the fun team, Indiana. I don't know. I got to be totally honest with you. I've been trying to break down what is the line of demarcation. What is the blowout quotient? I'll put it that way. What is the number that Ohio State has to get to for everyone to just give up on Indiana? I think it's lower than it should be. And I think it will be lower than it should be because I think a lot of people are going to look at a game where they lose by 14, let's say, and no disrespect, I think we all know that a lot of these people don't watch it quite as closely as we would like them to. If they lose by 14, but it was a tough game, Ohio State scores a touchdown with 2 minutes left to win that game, that should get Indiana in. There's no argument in my mind. They should be in because if you're an 11-1 team in one of the toughest conferences in the country, I know the strength of schedule is not great, and we'll have our conversation about the strength of schedule because, man, are people misusing it. But at the end of the day, this Indiana team would be 11-1. They would have a hard-fought game against Ohio State. If you leave them out, you're in trouble. I'm just going to be totally honest with you. You are in a lot of trouble for a number of different reasons, and you're doing a lot of interesting things. But at the end of the day, the flip side of that is if you do let them in at 11-1 and say they lose by 17 points to Ohio State, say they lose by 21, there's another conversation to be had because then you have the conversation of this is an 11-1 team that didn't play too many people out of conference. If we let them in at 11-1 and we leave out Tennessee at 10-2, are we just encouraging people to schedule Western Illinois, to schedule FIU, to schedule Western Carolina or whoever as they're out of conference games so they can get to that Big Ten slate or that SEC or Big 12 or ACC slate undefeated? That's a question we have to answer because I do think, I've talked about this a lot, I do think we have to lean into strength of schedule a little bit. I think some people are misusing it right now in their arguments, but I do think we have to lean into it just some. So I don't know what the line of demarcation is for Indiana. If they lose decidedly, I guess is the best way that I can put it right now. If they lose decidedly, I do think they would be on kind of that chopping block with Tennessee. If they win, if they're definitely in. If they lose by 3, they're definitely in. If they lose by 7, they're definitely in, and so on and so on. I just don't know when the number changes to they're definitely not in. So it's going to be interesting to watch that unfold, and as you can see, Indiana's still the team that they're the most worried about. They're still the team that if they lose this weekend, we'll find out just how these odds move, and maybe that'll give us a good idea before those rankings come out of how everything sits. But as of right now, Oregon, you're in. Congratulations. You are the first one to punch your ticket to the 12-team playoff. Ohio State, you're likely in. I think even if you lose to Indiana, I think that minus 20,000 tells you even if they lose to Indiana, they still would have a relatively good shot to get in. Penn State, you just got to win out. That's basically it for them. Indiana, you just got to hope. You got to hope that you fight this weekend, and then the CFP rankings treat you the way you probably should be treated if you fight this weekend. But moving over to the easy ones, the Big 12, this one has a ton of chaos scenarios. There are a lot of teams that are still in it. You can go all the way down to, I believe, Texas Tech, and they would still be technically in this race for the Big 12 championship. But we talked about this on here quite a bit. They're officially a one-bid league. That was one thing that was a little bit up in the air going into this weekend, but BYU lost. There's almost no way that someone from the Big 12 or the ACC really is going to get in with 2 losses after a conference championship as an at-large bid. Just not going to happen. We can talk about whether or not that's fair. I think it's more than fair. But at the end of the day, BYU, you just got to win out. You're in a really tough spot, no doubt about that. They technically can drop one of the next 2, but a million things would have to happen. So let's just say they got to win out the rest of the way. They got to handle their business, and a huge one this weekend against Arizona State that we'll break down tomorrow. And then Colorado, same deal. Win out the rest of the way. Kansas is going to do their best to create a mess on this season, and frankly, everyone that plays Colorado the rest of the way is going to want to ruin this. Let's just be totally honest. Not a lot of people like Colorado. They're going to try to take it out on them, no doubt about that. But as of right now, you're good, you're rolling, continue on your way. Arizona State, one more and just a win-out situation. So you're in a position where you beat BYU this weekend. You're going to be favored against BYU, by the way. We'll break that one down tomorrow as well. And then Arizona at the end of the year. You should be good. If you win those 2 games, you're in Arlington. You're probably playing Colorado or maybe Iowa State or maybe BYU again. Again, it's crazy in the Big 12, but at the end of the day, it is going to be interesting to watch this unfold, and right now, Arizona State's in a relatively good spot as we move forward into all this. Any loss, they're probably out of this thing. And then for Iowa State, they will need a little bit of help. I think that's the other team that I would really bet on possibly making it. They just need a Colorado loss. So one loss from Colorado maybe this weekend against Kansas. They win out the rest of the way, beat Kansas State at the end of the year. They would be in that Big 12 championship. So relatively simple. You know, you got to win this league to get in, no doubt about that. But you got the 4 teams up top. You got a couple other teams that are technically in it, but a lot of those teams will be knocked out this weekend, so we'll have a lot cleaner of a picture in this thing after Saturday. And you see it in the conference championship odds. We talked about it to one bid league, so figured I'd change up the odds just a little bit here. But Colorado still leads the way. That gap between them and BYU grew just a little bit. Arizona State, that gap is getting shorter and shorter as we go on. Iowa State obviously needing a little bit of help. And then Kansas State and Baylor still technically in it. Need about a million things to go their way to find their way back in it. So I wouldn't bet on it, but definitely would be crazy to watch. And then we got to get into the ACC really quickly because this one's the quickest one to take care of. You got 3 teams up top, and that's about it. There is not going to be 2 teams from this league. It is likely a one big league, and now Miami win out, and you're in the ACC championship with a spot in the CFP championship. No doubt about that. You have Wake Forest, Syracuse the rest of the way. Win those 2 games, you're meeting SMU, you have a shot to go. That's as simple as can be. Clemson, you're just hoping for a shot. You're hoping for one of those teams in Wake Forest or Syracuse to nip Miami over the next couple of weeks. Then you would be into the ACC championship. And then for SMU, just win this weekend. Win this weekend or next weekend, and you are in the championship game. So obviously beating Virginia this weekend and getting that bid would be more than fine going into that final week. But at the end of the day, it is going to be really interesting to watch. And technically, if they were to lose at Virginia this weekend and then at Cal at the end of the year, Clemson and Miami could be in that championship game. But we'll figure out what happens. The good news is it's just those 3 teams. There's no math that could get them down to the Syracuse getting in or Louisville getting in. So took care of a little bit of business this past weekend. But the odds are very, very simple. Miami's leading the way. SMU not too far behind. Clemson a little bit further behind because they need that one loss. But you know, this is kind of just the way it sits right now. I do tend to believe we're going to see Miami and SMU in that championship, but maybe things go a little bit crazy this weekend and Clemson gets a little bit of their groove back. But finally, group of 5 teams. You got 3. We talked about it earlier. Those are going to be your 3 teams, and I think the biggest thing here is kind of just to break down the pecking order as I see it for these teams. And to me, it goes undefeated Army. They would be in over everyone. If they were to beat Notre Dame, they would be the group of 5 team. I have a few questions about that. Whether or not a one-loss Boise State would get in, I think is up for debate. I'd be surprised if they got in over a 10-2 Tennessee or someone like that, but at the end of the day, still something to watch there, no doubt about that. But I do think it goes undefeated Army. If they win, they're going to be the team. Then it would go to one-loss Boise State that won the Mountain West Championship. If they do that and Army were to lose to Notre Dame, they would be in. And then I think it would go back to the American champion. Now, I think there's still some question of if Boise State loses a close one this weekend to Wyoming and then goes on to win the Mountain West, 11-2 them against an 11-2 Tulane. Could be a little bit of a battle, but I would expect it would go back to the American champion, so it could be a one-loss Army that lost to Notre Dame, could be a two-loss Tulane. So a lot of things still at play here. We'll break it all down throughout the time, but feels pretty cut and dry. Boise State, if they lose, Army, if they lose, then Tulane. So that's kind of the easiest way to break it down, and we'll see what happens the rest of the way. I've said that Tulane is the best team in the group of five. As of right now, if I was on the committee, I'd probably have Boise State in because of the resume, because of the few losses. So it's a battle back and forth between best and most deserving. I'm going to lean most deserving, at least in this respect. So going to be interesting to watch that unfold. And let's get into just the way I see it. Break this down very, very simply as I can. As of right now, the way that I see it is 4 Big Ten, 4 SEC, 1 ACC, 1 Big 12, 1 Group of 5, and Notre Dame. That's the way that it's breaking down right now. I'd expect that to be the way it breaks down if everything goes totally normal, all the favorites win, Indiana doesn't get blown out, all of that craziness. If Indiana does get blown out, if they get beaten by Ohio State decidedly, which we can talk about what decidedly mean. I think everyone has a different definition right about now. But for me, I'm going to say 3 scores. Anything over 3 scores, I would be a little bit worried about. Anything under that, I think they just have to get in. But we'll talk about that in nauseum, I promise, in the next couple of weeks. But if that were to happen, it would be 3 Big Ten. It would be 5 SEC. It would be 1 ACC, 1 Big 12, 1 Group of 5, and Notre Dame. In my mind, that's the way it would break down, as long, obviously, as Notre Dame were to win that game this weekend. And then if Notre Dame were to lose at some point, whether it's an Army this weekend or USC at the end of this, it would be 4 Big Ten, 5 SEC, 1 ACC, 1 Big 12, and 1 Group of 5 with Notre Dame in the mix. So that's as easy as I can make it, really. A lot of confusing numbers out there, a lot of confusing scenarios, but that's about as simple as I can make it right about there. We'll see what decidedly means in that Indiana-Ohio State game in the end of the week, but definitely a lot of different things at play here. Went a little bit long on this one, so got to wrap this up here. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we got winners and losers from this past weekend. Want to wrap up Week 12 for you guys right here in the next couple of segments, so stick around and we'll be right back with that.